Good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to the Society of Evidence-Based Policing's webinar series in partnership with the Youth Endowment Fund. Today we are talking about knife crime and escalation, what predicts it, and importantly, what doesn't. Hopefully you're in the right place and that's what you're expecting to talk about today. As usual on these sessions, we're going to take an unashamed focus on implementation and what things are like in practice. So we're going to talk about the research evidence, and we are joined by a panelist to help us do that, but also somebody who's at the front end of this and doing it in practice, like many of you who will be attending today. My name is Matt Bland. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Society of Evidence-Based Policing. If you haven't come across us before, you're very welcome. We are a UK charity set up by police officers and staff to promote the use of evidence, research evidence in policing, and these webinars are a really important way for us to connect with people across the sector and try to share ideas and amplify them. My colleague, Helen Kesrazadeh, is with us. Helen, if I could just ask you to introduce yourself as well, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. Helen Kesrazadeh. I'm Head of Engagement at the Society of Evidence-Based Policing. So after this, you're going to get an email with a link to the recording so you can watch it back. I'm also running the Q&A this morning. So if you've got questions for our panelists, please feel free to put them in.
So we've got a chat function and a Q&A function. Stick them in the Q&A. If they go in the chat, we'll still hoover them up anyway. But as the discussion goes on this morning, we'll ask you just to throw any questions you've got for our panelists in there, and we will try to get to those in the second half of the session after I've exhausted my list of questions. I'm going to ask, we've got two panelists, so I'm really grateful for giving up their time to share their expertise with us. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in turn, and then we'll kick off with the chat. Dr. Simon Harding, if I come to you first, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Professor Simon Harding. I am a doctorate in youth justice. I'm also the director of the National Centre for Gang Research, and I run my own business undertaking expert witness work for the courts and for defence called Criminology Services. I've written research around knife crime, and I engage on a weekly basis with young people who are involved in this activity. Thanks, Matt.
Terrific. Thanks, Simon. Very welcome. And Paul Connolly from MPCC, if I could ask you to tell us who you are, please.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you for the invite today, and thank you to those dialing in. Paul Connolly, I'm a detective inspector currently seconded to the NPCC National Police Youth Council for the National Knife Crime Centre, which is a fairly newborn project. I've been a police officer for a little over 17 years. The vast majority of my work as an operational police officer, certainly for 12 or 13 years, was urban street violence, tackling gang crime in London. I'm a Metropolitan Police officer by trade. The vast majority of the last 5 years, 6 years perhaps, has been working in the social media space, how social media impacts gang crime, but critically, and certainly relevant today, knife crime. I'm very passionate about knife crime. I've been impacted both personally and professionally in this space, and you'll probably hear my story a little later about how I got involved in it, but really pleased to be here, and hopefully I can answer most of the questions today.
That's brilliant. I mean, and that's like, I want to ask you that question now. I know we talked about where I was going to start, Paul, but you've just set me up for another one. But no, I'm going to come to Simon first. We're here to talk about essentially what predicts the risk of escalation. So what's going to make the sort of risk of carrying a knife turn into violence is where we're focused. But to start, I wonder if you could just take us around the research that there has been on knife crime most recently. What do you think is the sort of highlights that we might want to focus on in this area, of course, including your own research where applicable?
Well, thank you, Matt. Yes, let me just set the scene a little bit for people if I can. So what we know about knife crime is that it occurs in 3 or 4 kind of broad settings. So in research terms, this is what we call situating knife crime. And we know that knife crime occurs with certain groups, but it also occurs in certain locations. One of those spaces or locations is the domestic space. And knife crime, of course, is heavily associated to domestic violence. So the kitchen, unfortunately, is one of the kind of key areas for knife crime to occur. Another one is the nighttime economy. And of course, there can be a lot of knife crime linked to pubs, clubs, alcohol misuse, etc., fights that occur in those venues or outside in the proximity of those venues. And the third area is broadly termed public space. And this is where we largely focus on the behavior of young people and how knife crime plays out very much in public spaces, maybe linked to drug networks, street gangs, or just antisocial behavior or personal grievances that get out of hand. And those public spaces tend to focus in areas of high harm, which might be, for example, transport hubs, youth clubs or youth centres, public parks, and sometimes even in our high streets if those are contested areas. What we also know about knife crime is it has an emerging profile on social media, and that may well be developing now as a kind of separate public space for knife crime to occur. So knife crime has, in many ways, a universality to it. It has a ubiquity to it. There are a lot of issues to do with propinquity, which, again, a posh academic word for meaning closeness or proximity. And of course, it is a very interpersonal crime. It's something that occurs very much kind of face to face, unlike perhaps a shooting, for example. It has a high degree of lethality, which means it can lead very quickly to fatal outcomes or extremely serious outcomes. And we know, of course, that the homicide rate has reduced a little in the last few years, and that's largely thanks to the incredible emergency and medical services. We know knife crime is very concealable. We know it is very adaptable with young people, and that there is a preference now for longer knives, bigger knives, machetes, Rambos, swords even. And the boys that I interview tell me reach is king, which is a rather prophetic phrase, meaning the longer the item, the more likely you are to succeed. And the boys that I interview tell me that knife crime has a kind of real utility to itself. So those are the kind of broad understandings that we have. In terms of data, just very quickly, Matt, if I may, the offences in 2025 are down from last year. They're down from 54,500 offences logged in England and Wales to 49,000 or just over in England and Wales. So we're now back to pre-COVID levels of knife crime. And most forces in England and Wales have enjoyed a year-on-year fall. So the Metropolitan Police Service down about 17%, Greater Manchester down about 17%, and West Mids down about 15%. So overall, that's a 10% drop. The arguments have already begun as to how and why and where those drops are occurring. I have my own personal view, and my personal view is that this drop has largely occurred in the nighttime economy. And that's not least due to the fact that in the past 5 years, we've had the closure of 500 nightclubs, the closure of maybe 2,000 pubs. So we have fewer venues and locations where spontaneous arguments, fights, etc. can occur in the nighttime economy space. Moreover, when people leave a nightclub or a pub, they're no longer queuing in a busy taxi rank. They're getting an Uber home, and they're not necessarily queuing in a takeaway. They're getting an Uber home and then Uber Eats or delivery when they get home. So those venues and opportunities for spontaneous street violence have perhaps diminished or lessened. And I think if we were to dig into that research a little bit more, we would probably find that some of the decrease, much of the decrease, is taking place in the nighttime economy. Thank you, Matt.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, crikey, I could ask you 16 follow-up questions off the back of that. Before I come to Paul, Simon, I hate asking the question, is there research that? Because it's an impossible question to answer. Your impression of the split, you described 3 pockets of knife crime. I'll come to the social media bit in a minute, so I'll just put that to one side. Kitchen, so domestic situation, kitchen, because that's where the knives tend to be. Nighttime economy and other public spaces, which I guess is most commonly associated with urban street gangs. Do you have a sense of the breakdown of the volume of knife crime between those 3, and to what extent is there overlap between the actors in those 3 scenarios?
Well, touching on the research point, first and foremost, Matt, it's sketchy, it is ill-defined, and the data is of poor quality. There is insufficient research, basically. You would think with something that is such high public profile and high media profile that we would all, as researchers, be falling over money to undertake research in this domain. It's just not there. So we're having to kind of cobble together what we know. I would love for those areas that I've identified to be far more clearly delineated. And I would also like for greater overlaps to be identified. We know that individuals who have a propensity towards violence, interpersonal violence, are very likely to be involved in some form of domestic coercive behavior or violence at home. That we know. The exact figures on that, we don't know. Likewise with street crime, young people who are involved in drug networks or street crime networks, and drugs are more prolific than street gangs, just to be clear on that. They may also find themselves involved in altercations in clubland or in the nighttime economy. Some of the cases I've worked on recently have been where young men who are perhaps engaged in violent crime or drugs or gangs have gone clubbing with their friends, they've taken a line of cocaine, and what would have been a punch-up or a fisticuffs 10 or 15 years ago now involves the drawing of a knife. So the outcome can be far more lethal and far more serious than ever before. So that's certainly something. But the research evidence base is weak and is not as good as it should be.
Okay. I'm going to return to that later, but thank you, Simon. I'm going to turn to Paul now and ask about the sort of practice side of things. But Paul, I wonder if you could just start us off by saying, what is knife crime to law enforcement?
Thanks, Matt. What is knife crime to law enforcement? It will vary based on who you ask, and I can see we've got quite a mixed call here. Let's look first at how it's recorded in terms of the data and the headlines that you hear. So in knife crime, the one thing that knife crime doesn't include is possession of a knife. So when you look at the the ONS, when they report knife crime year on year, etc., what is not reported is the number of people that are found with a knife in their possession, or more recently in private. There's relatively new bit of legislation about knives in private. So that's the one thing that doesn't, which I think the public probably thinks it does include. I think the public, that 50,000 knife crimes per year, give or take 49,000. I think people think that's how many knives taken off people. So it doesn't include that. Knife crime could include, and Simon has alluded to already, to be recorded as a knife crime in the UK, it could be I threatened Simon with a shard of glass. That would be recorded as a knife crime because it's a sharp instrument. And I think for this conversation, that nighttime economy piece in particular, those bottling incidents, are very different. The way we police those are very different, but I'll comment on that in a second. So that's not included. The intimation of a knife. Again, I don't wish anyone to be a victim of robbery and attempted robbery, but if I was to walk up to someone in the street or someone's approaching the street and I, as a victim, perceive there to be a knife, be it a threat, as in verbalised, I have a knife, or shuffling in pockets and all those kind of indicators, that would be recorded as a knife crime. And I understand why, because in the victim's perspective, they believe they were robbed with a knife, and I do understand that. But that is contributing to a lot of this data. So to answer your question, knife crime is an incredibly thematic topic, and I've got concerns around how we're recording it, and it will be different across the 43 forces of England and Wales as well, might I add, and how that's looked at. So I think there's probably some work to be done there. So in terms of what is knife crime to me and what I think the public want me to do, because that's kind of my job, I think the key big areas for us are tackling domestic violence in the home and urban street violence. I think those are the key areas that sort of policing and the services can look at, because we can be quite proactive around that. I thought Simon's comments around the night time were really useful, actually, and it's not something I've considered before around sort of post-COVID effect and the Uber effects and stuff like that. And I definitely think there's validity in that. I think it's a really good point. But I think the public want us to reduce knife crime. That's why we're all here. And I think in their perception, it's reducing it in that urban street violence, young people often tackling each other with knives, and then that domestic setting. What I'll caveat is they are very two ways that we need to police it. They are totally different, polar opposites, in fact, in what the approach should be. And I'd argue who the lead agency should be.
Go on, just go further on that then. Who should be the lead agency if it's not police? I mean, I presume there's scenarios where it might be horses for courses, but what are you thinking there? What's your thinking there?
It's a really good question, and I feared you were going to ask me that, but not 12 minutes in.
You teed me up for it, so I'm sorry.
Didn't I? Yeah, it was just taking a duck to water there, wasn't it? Look, this is a community, a societal issue. The policing are here to enforce the law, and we put the word crime in something, knife crime, and our head, I understand why we do that, automatically goes to cops, law enforcement, etc. But there's a whole, and sadly, in the vast majority of cases, we are there right at the end of the story when the thing has happened, either person with knife or person injured or worse with knife. From a policing perspective, we are there normally right at the end of that story. There is a whole raft of things that happen long before that that could, should, or missed opportunities, or not. So sometimes it is spontaneous, and I'm definitely with Simon on the spontaneity piece as well, might I add. I think there's a role for I've actually got an interesting slide about this topic, but we're not going to go with social media today, but there's probably a role there. But actually, way more important than that, it's education. Obviously, the government education, I think, is incredibly important. We need a healthcare approach. We need to bring those people into the room. A psychology approach. Why are these young people, mainly young people, why are people carrying knives? Why are we going to a knife rather than I think you use the phrase fisticuffs, Simon, definitely a phrase I'm familiar with. What is driving our young people to go, this is the tool of choice today rather than perhaps this? And I'm not saying fighting's right, but I'm saying that's the shift that's had. I'm not entirely sure there should be a lead agency, but that's kind of my point, because at the minute it does often feel like police are the lead agency. I do genuinely think there's a space here for, obviously we've got the VRUs, but we've got social services, education sector, healthcare sector, academics, of course, have a role to play in this and the whole piece. So my view would be a very collaborative approach and not necessarily lead agency. Perhaps a little bit like we approach child safeguarding, the lead agency should be defined on the problem. Because I don't think in a domestic setting, the police are probably the best lead agency in that. Of course, we have a part to play in that. And we absolutely have a part to tackling violence against women and girls and domestic violence. But the way in which that is handled, I'm not sure police are the best people to deal with that on and of their own.
Really fascinating. I'm really interested in this sort of, you've both mentioned these different compartments to the knife crime problem, and to sort of overly simplify what you've said, it becomes a public and private space at a very high level. And you both referenced intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, which obviously has quite a well-established prevention support infrastructure around it in the form of things like multi-agency risk assessment conferences and so on and so forth. So I wonder, Paul, is your work, how much of your work gets into that space and how much is focused on the other side, which is the public space and those sort of urban street gang environment? What's the sort of split there? How much of NPCC's knife crime strategy is domestic abuse focused versus the street gangs?
Yeah, it's a fair question. the NPCC National Knife Crime Centre is very young and very new, and we're constantly evolving. Our key government priorities at the moment are the disruption of weapons availability, and particularly, ultimately we're part of the puzzle of halving that knife crime piece, which is the government's mandate. Our current focus is on the availability of weapons at street level. That is our primary focus, and that is. I won't go into definitions because those who know me know I'm quite passionate about it, but what you would call the zombie knife, the Rambo knife, the ninja sword, that kind of stuff. That is our current focus. That being said, we are actively involved. I'm okay to mention a few campaigns, Matt, I assume.
Go ahead,
yeah, thanks. I think Leanne Lucas in particular did some incredible work around the Let's Be Blunt piece. So those who don't know Leanne, she's one of the Southport survivors, done some incredible work with Leisha Nichols around looking at round-tipped knives in the home, post-incident or maybe early intervention stuff. And there's a couple of forces on the call that I know are doctors and those, and I think they're phenomenal projects. But again, the National Knife Crime Centre is we obviously have a 4Ps approach to our approach, and the focus at the minute is that kind of urban street gang, serious youth violence thing. But we absolutely have an eye on the domestic space. I think the domestic space or the home setting. Like I said, I'm quite passionate that this is. I'm not entirely sure the police should be the very first people through the hypothetical door, if that makes sense. I think that the people involved in those need a lot more other support that perhaps your average police officer is not the right person for.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that campaign. I was at a presentation Leisha Drew Nichols did yesterday at the Birmingham Police Academic Centre of Excellence conference. We'll get a link out to that work in the notes with this show, because it is a fantastic campaign and has immediately made me think about changing all the knives in my home to these round tip knives. I'm going to focus this discussion then on that urban street gang side and just park the domestic abuse segment of knife crime for this debate. I'm going to ask you this question, both of you, and I think, Simon, I'll come to you first, and then Paul will just sort of play the practice through it. In that urban street environment setting, what does the research say elevates the risk of somebody being involved in serious harm, if there is anything there? And Simon, that doesn't need to be quantitative. You've obviously had lots of experience talking to these people who are involved in this scene. And then, Paul, I'm interested in, be interested to sort of hold that up to how that's playing out, how forces are actively identifying individuals, what the pipeline is through to the preventative work and engagement. I can repeat that question later on, but Simon, let me go back to you first just to ask them from the research perspective.
Very good. Thank you, Matt. Yes, well, the street gang youth violence world is very much my domain. I've spent 20, 30 years plus working in this area now, and I've interviewed over 500 young people who are actively involved in street gangs. And I can tell you every single one of them was involved in carrying a knife or multiple knives or bladed articles. So it's a big challenge. Street gangs come from poverty, and knife crime, public space knife crime, is heavily linked to areas of poverty, bearing in mind, of course, some of that interpersonal violence can play out in areas such as public parks, high streets, outside shops, that type of thing, bus stops, etc. But what I've learned is that the kind of profile of the individuals involved that I work with they're likely to be young males aged between 14 and 25. They're what I call street socialized, largely, not exclusively, but largely. So they're socialized by the street with very loose parental kind of controls or oversight. And in the south of England, we would call that perhaps on road. I don't know if that's a terminology that translates further up country, but very much street socialized, possibly with links to criminal networks, drug networks, county lines, etc. Or if not association to street gangs, affiliation to street gangs. They're slightly different things. Association is knowledge of and hanging around. affiliation is day-to-day socializing with street gangs. If you are a day-to-day socializer and affiliated with street gangs, there is an absolute cast iron imperative for you to carry a blade. And if you do not, then one will be used against you. So it's that profound. The individuals I work with have a very high level of vigilance. A vigilance around their own personal status, their position in a hierarchy, possibly, and their level of respect. And that involves them monitoring everything that is said to them, every stare or look that is given to them, and anything and everything that happens online. And if any of those elements interfere with their status, their hierarchical position, or their level of respect, so that they think they're being diminished in some way, they will retaliate. They will take instant corrective action. And that instant corrective action is usually through a knife attack or a knife incident. We also have a high degree of competition now between street gangs, between street gang individuals, and between drug networks. And a lot of that now will play out in terms of violence. If the street gang members are younger, they may be more focused on turf, territory, and postcode, and that can be a reason for engaging in knife crime. But very heavily, the issues rely on issues of respect, or more accurately, disrespect. And these act as the kind of key triggers, to the extent now that within some gangs in London, Manchester, Birmingham, and one or two other areas, we have what I call effectively a stab on sight imperative, whereby groups of young individuals will see a rival, somebody who's disrespected them, and they will immediately carry out a spontaneous attack. And that kind of thing is very distressing for the public because it plays out in the public domain. And it's frightening in terms of the speed and the lethality. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the deaths of young boys, particularly in the metropolitan areas.
I think this is if I might be doing this a disservice. Do you call this the street casino environment?
I do call it the street casino, yes.
Which is quite an engaging term. Before I just come to Paul, let me just prod at the provenance of your, because you've given a very clear and coherent narrative there, which paints a picture of sort of a knife crime as a byproduct of the sort of market economics, if you like, of the drugs environment. What type of research did you do to get to the point where you're telling that story?
Well, I'm focusing largely on my work as an expert witness, where I will get a case bundle that is already within the criminal justice system. It's going before the court. I will then interview the young person for between 1 hour and 3 hours. So commonly about 2 hours of interviewing, where I dive very deeply into their family background, their personal behaviors, their motivations, their links, their networks, their engagement with drugs or otherwise, how they are being sometimes groomed and coerced, and sometimes how they are kind of active, very active in this space and purposefully active. So it's given me an enormous depth of oversight and purview into this mat in a way that I simply never had when I was a researcher working at universities. I mean, the ethics committees would squash this before you even got close to it. So I'm very fortunate in that my role as an expert in court, and I'm in the Old Bailey tomorrow in just such a case. It gives me enormous oversight and purview of data and qualitative immersion that I would otherwise not have got.
That's great. Thanks, Simon. Paul, I want to play some of that through the operational lens then. my overarching question is, how are people going into the pipeline of preventative work, and how does it marry up to the picture that Simon has painted for us?
Yeah. Again, fair question, and thanks for your views, Simon. I think what's important to remember at the minute is, without sort of saying the problem's too large, the demands on the policing are very broad at the moment, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of our work is responding and reacting at a local level to what's actually happening on the day. I'd love to say we have, the capabilities and the resource, certainly the policing end, to do that kind of, hard preventative work. But what I will talk about is some of the work we've done with some of our partner agencies, VRUs in particular, but also some really, I'm very lucky. A report that I was part of last year got to meet some incredible charities that are doing very good work at, I suppose, a street level, for want of a better phrase. Again, sadly, from the police end, in terms of referrals, we tend to come to the scene when, and when I say scene, I mean that young person that may not have committed a serious crime or harmed anyone, perhaps been found with a knife. So much has happened prior to that, and there's probably a whole catalogue of history for that young person, school reports, social services reports, etc. The police simply don't see that piece. The solution has to be multi-agency. You've referred to it already, Matt. The role the police have in that is absolutely highlighting, and I accept that we've not always got it right, but I think we're getting better. Absolutely highlighting those individuals who we believe are at risk. One category of individuals which is starting to be talked about a lot at the minute are violence-fixated individuals, which don't have their own category in crime. But often a young person, but not exclusively. I'm not going to talk about specific cases, but many of you will know. Young person absolutely purely fixated on violence, no real sort of ideology, so falls outside that kind of CT space and needs a level of intervention. He or she, often he, is might be saying strange things, and if the police come across that, absolutely we have to make those referrals in and have those safeguard multi-agency meetings. I do think more work could be done at a local level for focused charity work around once that individuals come to the light. I'll talk about London because that's specifically where I've worked for most of my career. I appreciate now I have a national role, but I can talk, with confidence about London, where a young person comes into the system, be it a police referral, education referral, or a court referral, something that I might refer to. How confident are we that the package is there for that young person? That it's bespoke to them. I think we've got very good models of this box, and this box, but every young person is different. They come with their own traumas and their own experiences and their own, I suppose, motivations for carrying a knife, using a knife. And I don't know if our response at the minute is tailored enough, but equally, I'm not sure the resources there to do that, if I'm brutally honest with you. So at a street level, I'll be really honest with you, from policing, we are reacting to crime in the vast majority of cases. We want to do more preventative work. We've formed the National Knife Crime Centre, and it's written into the plan that stakeholders are a key part of that plan, and we've brought them into our space, and academics as well. And the conversations like this are really important to us. But I go back to the very first question you asked me, which is, where is the police role in this? Do we want the police to be that kind of cradle to grave for that young person? Because I don't think that young person does either. Believe it or not, they don't listen to cops. They do listen. They listen to people that look like them and talk like them and are in their communities. So community leaders, I think, or those sorts of organisations. Again, a really good nod to someone like Farron Alex Paul, Faz Amnesty, doing some incredible work in London, and he will grip those young people. And there's a whole bunch of safeguarding and signposting and redirection. Do I think more could be done for diversion before the police get involved? Yes, I do. I do think there's more that could be done.
And from what I'm going to introduce personal bias here, because I was an intelligence analyst for a few years, and I imagine the way into some of these street gangs is through intelligence mapping, through organised crime group mapping. That obviously is a police resource. I'm interested in, Paul, the reality, I suppose, of what might be the equivalent of a MARAC for urban street gangs. But where that sort of case conference work goes on, there are the Youth Endowment Fund of piloted focused deterrence across the country, which is sort of bringing in that tailored approach, but it's not universal yet. Where Yeah, where are you seeing that happening? What sort of good examples, or if there
Yeah,
are good examples or bad
yeah.
examples?
So you've probably heard of clear hole build.
Yeah.
So clear hole build, I think we're still very early on that. I can't profess, as we said before, Matt, I'm not the academic or the statistician in the room, but the clear hole build is still relatively new in policing, and let's be honest, a decade could still be relatively new, but clear hole build is certainly nearer than that. So those who don't know, but it's been adopted nationwide now in various forces. Is the clear hole builders will concentrate on a geographic location. Now, often the gangs, as Simon's already alluded to, are bound by there will be some level of geography around them. Certainly, the urban street gangs will do. Could be a specific estate, could be a postcode, whole raft of things. The clear hole build will, without going to the nitty gritty of how this works, police will look at a larger area, identify concentrations of violence, and I'll talk about some hex work in a moment. They'll say, right, this particular estate in North London, we'll go with that, or Birmingham, we'll go Birmingham. An estate in Birmingham is particularly problematic. It's a driver of lots of different crime types, not just knife crime, albeit it will be scored accordingly, of course. And then the clear hole build policies are, when it's done well, is a multi-agency approach. So the clear is the police bit. So we go in and almost what it says in the tin, we try and clear up an estate for an enforcement piece. But there is other stuff going on underneath that. There's community leads stepping in, potentially street passes or something similar. The education piece is involved, etc. And then there's the hold bit, which is the sort of specialist units that might do that clearing up bit. That could be using police intelligence to tackle a gang. So, for example, and Matt, you've worked in this space, and Simon, this won't come as a surprise. Intelligence suggests Paul Connolly's carrying a knife. To actually prove he's done that off the back of intelligence is nigh on impossible unless you get lucky. Yeah, it's we unfortunately we don't just follow everyone around in the event they might pick up a knife. That's just simply not our reality. But actually, Paul Connolly, he could be committing domestic violence. He could be a drug dealer. He could be something that actually people who could, from the police angle, we could absolutely look to target that, and we might start looking at ways of removing him from that community and pushing that in. So whilst we're not directly targeting him for knife crime, we are targeting the knife offender. I'm going to say offender-led because I think that's the right approach. So in that clear hole build structure, we look at our high harm offenders, and we will try and remove those from the settings and really try and dismantle a gang, for want of a better phrase. It's been done to really good success in some of the work I've done. But then the tricky bit is the arse bit, which is the hold and the build. So that is where the police have to step away, and lots of that resource, and it's money ultimately, isn't it, has to step away, and it's stopping that, for want of a better phrase, creep coming back in, because crime is generational and younger people coming back through, etc. And that bit there is a real challenging piece, and that's where from a policing perspective, your community leads are absolutely crucial. Your safe neighbours officers, your PCSOs, and your safe neighbours leads, because they are the eyes and ears on the street as to what's going on. But there's a whole thing in that, which is the community, because they need to tell us what's going on. Lots of people will say, such and such is doing this, such and such is doing that. And I'm not saying we've got to get everyone to court and that sort of stuff and be witnesses of a crime, but it only works if the community are on board with it, which I think is really, really important. And then the final bit is that building it up. And that's where I think police almost do step away. And that's around things like designing out crime, so making nicer spaces for people, make it feel like a home. Simon's mentioned poverty already. Be proud of your area, be proud of your space, and that would we would hope would really shift people's attitudes to how they behave in public. But critically, make it not okay to be antisocial. Give the public the confidence to challenge those younger people to be antisocial. Make that kind of behaviour a little bit when someone's smoking in a pub or someone's going to go and drink drive. Give the public the confidence to challenge that. Perhaps not directly if they think that they're going to come to harm, but certainly there is an avenue here, and that's the police, and that's on us to build that relationship with the community. But we need feedback as well. I've been to community events to talk about this topic, and a community which will quite rightly complain that nothing's been done about knife crime in the area, and a number of us will turn up. We'll bring everything from free tea and coffee to pens to police officers, and we'll have a handful of people turn up, and we'll try and plan it around evening times, things like that. And then conversely, I've been to other parts of the country, in fact, and we've had to turn people away because it's so busy, and it's that whole disparity. How we deal with that is a whole other question, I guess.
Thank you. Simon, did you want to come in?
Yes, I think thanks, Paul. That's a very helpful explanation. Um, to offer some critique to that, if I can, we're talking really here about what has been quite often termed the practice gap, and the way that I see things from my side of the fence is that there has been a loss of skill around intelligence and around analysis. So the slightly rose-tinted view that Paul gave there, and I wish it would work, Paul, and I wish you all the best with it. But it's, for me, it's slightly unrealistic because it fails at the very first hurdle. We don't have the intelligence and the data analysis that we used to have even 10 or 15 years ago. In fact, data analysts are so scarce and rare. I expect them to be studied by David Attenborough. You know, it's just not a function that is central as it used to be. And the officers I speak with are absolutely terrified of GDPR. They think they're going to lose their job if they share data. And I find myself advising on conversations about data sharing that I had 25 years ago or longer, when the Crime and Disorder Act was brought in by Jack Straw at the end of the last century. A lot of that stuff has simply not moved on. And then my next critique would be for academics. Where are they in this space? They're not doing enough. They're not pitching in. And that's partly because of lack of money, and they're inhibited by ethics committees and all the rest of it. But they're not pitching in, and they need to. They need to be offering services to help analyze what's going on locally in their own area. And then there's a failure to ask young people. There's a failure to engage young people. They've got to be part of this solution. And then I think nationally we're far too ready to kind of borrow and transfer from America, and we need far more homegrown solutions from the bottom up. And I think that's been part of our failure in the past, is that we've not done that. We've allowed the whole dimension to become political. We've gone for quick, fast wins that turn out not to be quick, fast wins, and not as cheap as we thought. And we need something that's more sustainable over time.
It's great. You can really sort of hear the passion that both of you have for this area, and that's fantastic to contribute to it. But my questions are, I'm going to end my questions and throw this open to Helen to ask the much more interesting questions that have been piling up in the Q&A. So Helen, over to you.
Thank you. And yeah, they have really been piling up. So thank you everyone for contributing. I'm going to take one from one of my old colleagues in Wiltshire. Lisa has asked a question. So they had a youth engagement week last week, and we were advised that 99% of children do not carry a knife. And I'm of the opinion that this will have increased. Do you have any up-to-date stats, either of you, to prove or disprove this number?
I'll jump in on that very quickly.
I think
she's probably right. The stats vary very considerably locally. So obviously there's going to be less knife carrying in rural or provincial areas than there would be in urban areas. And even in urban areas, there can be a huge dichotomy between better off areas and areas of poverty. And we are talking very much about concentrations in areas of poverty, deprivation, and inequality. There can be a further increase in areas that have got a very high volume of social housing or a high volume of young people resident in that area. So you will find some areas, perhaps in the outskirts of London, more suburban, more elderly, mature populations, again, lower levels of knife carrying there. So it can vary. And of course then we have the whole issue of social media, which acts as a kind of accelerant to this, giving the impression that everybody's carrying a knife, and of course they're not. But that's very convincing for a lot of young people, especially when this is what they see day in, day out. So again, I wish I could put my finger on research specifically for you, but it's very scattered and not necessarily there.
Thanks. Anything you want to add to that one, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand this is really interesting because this comes down to that perception debate as well. So the perception of knife crime and the scale of it. So the data, and I'm not a data person, but this is part of my role, is anywhere between 2 and 4% of young people have carried a weapon of some sort. That's the data. And now weapon is quite a large. I believe that included firearms as well. And I want to quote Ian Brennan, but I'll have to go and check. Who's knows this area very, very well. So that the data suggests between 2 and 4% of 13 to 17-year-olds at some point, so not necessarily habitually, have carried a weapon of some sort. Do I think there's a cohort of people that habitually daily carry a knife? Yes, of course I do. Of course that, and Simon's alluded to it. It's almost a lifestyle offence for some people, unfortunately. Do I think that it's greater than 4 or 5% of young people that carry knives? I actually don't. I think. Look, I've given my views in public, so I don't mind sharing here. We created some legislation and called something a zombie knife. And like that already drives that perception of fear, that kind of undead, kind of thing. You have I was about to name a newspaper there, but you can all guess where I was going to go with that one. You have regular tabloid newspapers. I mean, one of the bits of data last year was there was something like 200 to 300 stabbings in London every day. Absolute nonsense, but they get far more traction than Paul Conley saying there's 2% of young people carrying knives, or the actual data that says 2% of young people carry knives. I think there's a range. I think in certain parts of the UK, in certain urban areas, it's greater than 2 to 4%. It has to be, doesn't it? Because that's how data works. And I think in some parts of particularly rural areas, I think it's probably pretty much zero, if I'm brutally honest, which gives you that 2 to 4% range. So I actually don't think it's as high as that we perceive. The headline, you would never get a headline going, no one carried a knife today. It's just not, it's not news, is it? And look, I'm touching wood here, and I'm really hoping and praying that this continues. Everyone is aware of when we have school stabbings or a knife is used in a school, and thankfully it is still relatively rare in terms of the UK anyway. And we're not here to talk about America, and I'm 100% with Simon on our approach. But actually, touch wood and whistle, we don't have that many incidents in schools. And I think actually that cohort, that 13, 17-year-old, they are in school most of the time, or at least they should be. And I think if there was a lot more knife carrying, this 10, 20, 15, 20% of people we think, I think we probably would see a lot more of it. Now, that's not being said, I'm not naive enough to think it's underreported. I'm not naive enough to think that, is there an issue with an education system where they're not informing schools if John has a knife they don't. Of course, I know that happens, but that's all underreported. You can't really measure that. So that would be my view on that. I don't think it's as high as I think the media think. And also, from the police end, that's all we really focus on. We just focus on the very tiny percentage of society that are committing crime, and it is really a small percentage of society. Statistically, it is a relatively safe country, which is good. But of course, there's work to be done. We wouldn't be here if there wasn't.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Paul, I'm going to stick with you because I've had a question from Ethan Thomas very much about what you're doing in the national picture. So he says, I'm interested in how local investigations feed into the national picture. When police recover a knife, is there a consistent process for tracing how that knife reached the young person carrying it? For example, was it through the home, the shop, through an online purchase, which I know you do a lot of work on? And is that information then fed into the national intelligence picture and makes its way back to policing so that they can then intervene where they need to, rather than treating each case sort of on an individual basis?
I think that's a great question. Whoever that is either heard me talk before or is in my head.
Probably.
So I think they might have teed me up there. So I use the phrase life of a knife. So how does knife end up from what is probably China, because that's where most of them are made, to the hands of a 13, 14-year-old in Nottingham or in Liverpool or wherever, Wiltshire or wherever you're all from? How does that actually happen? When we wrote the end-to-end review last year, that was kind of one of our objectives, the process map, the chain, if you like. The honest answer is we don't know how many knives are imported into this country. We couldn't tell you. The data simply isn't there, and there's lots and lots of reasons behind that. A lot of it is legislation based, albeit it is changing. So I couldn't tell you 10,000 knives reported into the UK last year. Generally speaking, knives used in crime aren't produced in the UK. Just that's why I'm sort of talking about importation. Generally speaking, we'll put domestic matters to one side as a domestic incident. I would love to do more work, and there is some work, and there are people in the call because I've seen them dialing in and doing this work at a local level. So when they're talking to a young person in, sadly, custody, how did you get hold of this knife? The issue you have, and Simon's alluded to conversations he's had with young people, but Simon's in a very different position to a police officer. And they are going to naturally open up to Simon because of his role as a defence expert witness, but they're not going to open up to the Paul Connolly or the police officers. And I understand that because there's a whole legislation piece behind that. But to track how this knife, call it a Rambo knife, albeit I hate the phrase, how this Rambo knife ends up in my pocket, there's actually quite a lot of work there to be done in terms of supply chains. We've got some hypotheses. I think the underreported and the high risk is around importations. That the model I just described, overseas websites shipping knives into country in singles or multiples. Yeah, we know that as an issue. We know young people are actively importing these knives themselves, probably not realising they're committing these offences of importing prohibited weapons. I think the other thing to remember is not all knives are illegal. They only become illegal once they go into the streets. So there's only so much we can do in terms of prevention. It is not uncommon for me to get a call from UK Border Force to say, Paul, there's a shipment of 200 machetes going to an industrial estate or a thing. I would love to be able to just wave a wand and say, nah, because they're probably going to be used in crimes. I'm going to use a police power and take that away. The law doesn't afford me to do that. Do I think it will do down in the future? Yeah, it might do. Yeah, hopefully, because I'm hoping to write it. But that at the minute we can't stop that. If the thing is prohibited, we the police can do a level of prevention work, and that's really important. A knife starts life as a tool, and that's really important to remember. It starts life as a tool. That's what this should be designed for. So to answer the question, no, not enough is being done to the life of the knife. The only one space, and it's tragic that it happens this way, the one space that does happen is homicide. So when the homicide happens, there is a lot more resource put into that, and I'm sure you will understand why. A lot more resources put into that homicide to identify that route, the whole thing, offender, victim, and the knife supply chain, and that's right. Sadly, your average investigator, and that's not a derogatory term, your average investigator in a police force will come in every shift, be given an offender to deal with an interview with a knife, and she simply doesn't have the capacity to then go, where am I going? There is also an issue there around police powers, because there's only certain things we can get. We need police powers to go and find out certain information because of human rights and this sort of stuff, quite rightly. So we can't always finish that piece of the puzzle, and certainly not for every single knife we seize. We absolutely want to do it. I know it is happening at a local level, and they are absolutely feeding into me because, like I said, there's at least 2 of them on the call today that are doing it. But we're still very early on. And if it's something people want to get involved in, certainly the law enforcement on the call, then I might regret this, but please give me an email.
Yeah, I think if you're happy for people to reach out, I think they would definitely be keen to do that. Right, I'm going to try and summarise quite a few questions. They're all based around a very similar theme. I think it's that almost golden answer that everyone would like to have, but it's around actually how can we prevent knife crime. So there's questions about, is it around early intervention, is it around how we engage with young people? And Simon, I don't know from the expert witness work that you've done whether there were any pieces that you really took away from that you can comment on. We know it's about multi-agency working, but what actually is the golden answer, I suppose? Is there one? Have we got any examples of where, for example, I know Northampton police do some great work. Have you got any examples that you're maybe going to push out from an NPCC perspective that people can replicate? Sorry, I know that's lots of questions in one. Simon, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, I'll cover a few points on that, if I may. One of the issues that I'm regularly hearing, and of course, please, audience, recognise that I have a long experience as a local authority worker and practitioner, community safety manager and director, and 5 years at the Home Office. So I've been very much a practitioner academic. What I know is that there's a huge repetitive discussion about the protection narrative. People carry knives for protection. I seldom find that now. What I find is people carry knives for enforcement. to enforce their reputation, to enforce their drug network, their business, their profit line, their territory, their turf. Or enforce gang rules. It's much more about empowerment and protection than it ever used to be. In terms of good practice, it's sporadic. There is no universal good practice. I know there's been some discussion about focused deterrence and what might be called the pooling levers model from Boston ceasefire and from America. We've tried that and it didn't work for a whole variety of reasons in the UK, largely because when it works in America, they have the kids have to attend diversion activities because of a court order. We don't do that, and we can't do that in this country, so we can't mandate people to attend. I'm also conscious of the recent College of Policing report, which, you know, well, at 140 pages, it's not actually a quick read. Let my critique perhaps end there. But, you know, it leans on particular models, which I think are maybe a little bit out of date, to be honest with you. The one thing that I do completely support Paul on, and that is partnership working. We've forgotten how to do it. The current government has, and the previous government, have let the entire community safety profession wither away on the vine. And everybody since COVID have retreated back into their silos where they're only prepared to do a certain amount of work and draw a circle around their remit and not get involved in anything above and beyond that. Well, that's not going to get us out of this position around violence or knife crime. We need partnership working. Multi-agency work is the only way to address this. And on that, I'm in complete concert with Paul. We also have borrowed far too much from America around the violence reduction units. I have a number of PhD students who have been researching this for the past 4 or 5 years, and they're simply not performing. They are underperforming, although I suspect we will be told that they have been successful. But the reality is it's a lot of what I would call dynamic inertia. There's a lot of movement and a lot of money to stand still. It's not actually moving things forward in any declarative way, I would say. So we have a big challenge there. Too many initiatives are short term. There's not enough money, not enough partnership working. And there's a whole range of things that we should be doing. I have a long list of solutions for you. If I could talk all afternoon about this. And we're just not doing them enough. And they're not being evaluated. They're not being monitored. They're not being refunded year on year. So they're very, very short term. Is there good practice? Yes. It's very sporadic and it's usually small and quite invisible and quite often not replicable. And we're still not engaging young people in the way that we should do. If you know, if I can give you one soundbite that I've developed myself, it's this: we need to find solutions with young people, not solutions to young people.
Well, I've got time to just jump in there, Helen. Is that okay?
Go for it.
Thanks. So I suppose you made a valid point about the knife crime sovereign goal being 140 pages long, but equally we've all got long lists of ideas, so they're kind of the same thing. But I think the thing that I've made a few notes there. I think you've got to know your problem before you know your solution. So what is the problem? And these problems are very different based on where you go in the country. The problem that you have in a state in South London is very different to a problem you might have in West Yorkshire. And you need to know the problem before you go boom. So there is no golden bullet, is the first thing I'll say.
Correct.
I don't believe there is anyway. I think we need to be evidence informed or evidence-led, whichever term you like. I prefer evidence-informed, if I'm brutally honest. We need to follow where that goes. Like, what is the data actually telling us? And while we're trying to assess this problem, we need to assess it properly. We need the academics. We need folk like like you could say, the SCBP involved in this conversation, because cops are not data analysts. We're not academics. The odd one is, but generally speaking, but we are quite good at getting stuff done. I'll be honest, we are quite good at that. You tell us what needs to do, and we're pretty good at it, which is important. But we need to work together. So there is no one size fits all, and there never should be, because there isn't a one size fits all to raising a child, and there's not a one size fits all to looking after a sick adult, right? And that's not to do a crime. So that's the first thing. Know your problem before you start thinking about the solution. There are a range of tactics available. There are a range of things you could do. I don't think they will involve, in fact, they don't, and nor should they all involve policing. And I think that's the stakeholder piece comes in there. But I'll be honest, and I've said this a lot. I mean, I stepped away from saying it before, but I don't mind anymore, because it's a really important topic to me, knife crime. I don't know how many young people there are in the UK at the moment. My priority is, as a dad and as a police officer, is to stop young people coming to harm. That is my absolute mission in, well, frankly, life. And I don't really mind how it's done. If every parent in this country looked under their child's bedroom tonight, we would stop a knife crime tomorrow. It's as simple as that. And I'm not saying frog march your child to a police station. I'm saying there's loads of ways you can get rid of that: knife bins, surrender schemes, anonymous hand it in, whatever. I'm not saying you need to criminalise your child, but if every parent did that and accepted this could be a problem within our society, then I think we'd actually might make quite good headway. That would be my takeaway, because I get asked to a lot of community events. So just look under your kid's bedroom tonight. The same with their mobile phones. Look at your kid's phone. They're talking about.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to have to stop. I'm going to have to stop you guys there, because I'm very conscious of people's time. I want to say thank you very much to Simon and Paul. Clearly a depth of knowledge and passion about a really important topic, and we clearly can't do it full justice in an hour, but I hope this discussion and debate has prompted some thinking, given you some new ideas and enthusiasm to dive in. We will put out recording and a summary, and we will put out some notes. The questions we haven't answered, we will put to Paul and Simon, and we will put those out with the email that goes around after this event. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope to see you next time when we'll be talking about trauma-informed practice. Thank you.